I am absolutely thrilled that through the connectiveness of the law firm of Woods Oviatt and Reuben Ortenberg, thank you, who was a prior presenter here when the movie Bridge of Spies came out and all of the hype around that. I was introduced through Reuben to Anthony Palermo. His biography is long and extensive. I won't even attempt to try to replicate it, but for our purposes, he was a past president of the New York State Bar Association. But for today's purposes, he was the young U.S. attorney on the case which is portrayed in the book Strangers on a Bridge, which subsequently became a movie, which we saw last night, called Bridge of Spies, which James Donovan portrayed the defense counsel. Tom Hanks was portrayed the defense counsel, James B. Donovan, who was a junior, or actually the number 2 attorney with Robert H. Jackson at the Nuremberg trial. So all this connectiveness to today, and Anthony Palermo, who he, together with his lovely wife, joins us today, coming back from Florida. Welcome back, and for make a special appearance here today. What's cool in this book is the fact that there's actually a page which outlines the criminal trial of the United States versus Rudolf Ivanovich Abel, and there, representing appearances for the government, is one Anthony R. Palermo, who was attorney to the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. For the defense, James B. Donovan. And so for us in the business, this is kind of proof positive. We have, just a quick aside, one of the board members of the Jackson Center is E. Barrett Prettyman, Jr. He was a law clerk for Robert Jackson and loves to pull out this captioned art where he is the head attorney on a brief filed before the United States Supreme Court, and also appearing at the very bottom is a guy named John G. Roberts. He loves to showcase that, Prettyman Roberts. So what I wanted to show before we get going, and we'll start it now, is a late 1950 newsreel, which we're going to show, which sort of sets the stage for the trial of which Tony was a part of. So if we could show that now, and I don't know if you could.
Americans need no better proof than the atom bomb. 1960. That's the year our technical experts thought Russia would finally be able to develop a bomb. 1949 is when they had their bomb. For much of that 11-year pole vault, credit Russian espionage agents aided by national traitors. They did away with much of our lead time on the atom bomb. Despite the increasing manifestations of friendship offered by the Russians, their unwavering desires are plain. Can anything be plainer than the flat statement of Nikita Khrushchev, "We will bury you," and the "you" is us. But words, threatening or whatever, are still only words. We look for deeds, proof. Americans at heart are all from Missouri. Perhaps there is no better proof of the steady intensity of the Soviet offensive against the security of the United States than an actual documented case that had its start on a Brooklyn, New York residential street. It was 1953. A young newsboy had just finished the weekly collections from his paper route. He began to count the nickels and dimes to make sure the total amount was correct. A 5-cent piece slipped out of his hand to the pavement. He was astonished at what he saw. The nickel had split into 2 equal segments, revealing a small piece of microfilm. The coin was hollow. The newsboy could not understand it, But he had the good sense to report the incident to the New York police, who in turn passed the hollow coin and its contents to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The microfilm contained a code which Bureau cryptoanalysts were able to break, with the aid of information supplied to the Bureau by a former Soviet secret agent. His information, along with the decoding of the message found in the hollow coin, were to lead only a short distance away from the federal courthouse in Brooklyn to a building nearby. On the top floor of 252 Fulton Street, a studio had been rented in the name of E. Goldfuss. Occupation, artist, or so his neighbors thought.
Did you ever wonder about him, what his occupation was or anything?
Well, I thought he was an artist. He dressed like an artist.
What? How was that? How did he look?
Well, most of the times that I've seen him, he wore a brown suit and tie open, you know, shirt unbuttoned.
He wasn't too talkative, the man. Only if he walked into my shop, he'd sit down and talk to me about electronics, what his problems are on his radios, and so forth. And I would advise him, and he would tell me if he's doing the right thing, and I would, you know, talk back and forth with him.
Much to the surprise of the neighbors of Goldfuss, on August 7th, 1957, the tenant of that studio was charged with being a colonel in Soviet intelligence. His real name, Rudolf Ivanovich Abel. The United States Attorney declared that Colonel Rudolf Ivanovich Abel was the most important Soviet spy ever caught in the United States. He was charged with being an active spy over a period of 9 years. The FBI carefully investigated the contents of his apartment and his nearby studio. The search turned up such espionage items as radio and electronic equipment, including microfilm and a shortwave radio set. There were hollowed-out pencils containing film and numerous cryptic messages, some in code. They also found other cleverly fashioned containers for the transmission of defense secrets, hollow bolts and hollow nails, hollow cufflinks or earrings that could contain secret messages. Colonel Abel had rented a safe deposit box in a New York bank, where agents found $15,000 in cash. When he was arrested, Abel had another $6,000 on his person. Abel pleaded not guilty and was defended by one of New York's most prominent attorneys, appointed by the Bar Association to ensure him a fair trial. In a pre-trial statement, the attorney made clear what the nature of Abel's defense would be.
It should be sharply distinguished from such a case as that of the Rosenbergs, who were charged with betraying their own country. Assuming that the charges in this indictment are true, Abel is quite evidently not only a man who has performed an exceedingly hazardous mission for his own country.
The basis of Abel's defense, then, was that he was an admitted professional spy and had conducted himself within the code of that profession. Abel did not testify in the trial and offered no defense witnesses. The United States Attorney offered several witnesses, both Russian and American, to make his case against Colonel Abel, proving the colonel to be an active operative in the Soviet espionage apparatus known as the KGB, operating directly under orders of the USSR Council of Ministers in Moscow. The KGB serves as a worldwide collector of information. In each country, a number of independent spy cells pass information into the apparatus. Members of one spy cell do not know of the existence of agents in other rings. After the government's attorney rested his case, the defense attorney made his presentation. Through newspapers, radio, and television, the eyes and ears of a perplexed, troubled American people were on this courthouse. Then on November 15, 1957, came the verdict. Colonel Abel had been found guilty. Said the U.S. attorney.
I believe that the jury verdict in this case was more than amply warranted by the evidence, which I feel was overwhelming, and which strikes a very, very severe blow at Soviet espionage in this country.
Colonel Rudolf Ivanovich Abel was sentenced to 30 years in prison. How many secrets passed from Colonel Abel to the Soviet Union is not yet publicly known. But this is clear. Abel and his Russian confederates were basically intermediaries who collected their information from Americans in a position to know our defense secrets. Colonel Abel was the leader of only one Soviet spy network in the United States.
In 1957, convicted Russian spy Rudolf Abel was sentenced to 30 years, escaping the death penalty after his attorney argued that the United States might want to swap Abel for an American at some future time. Now, Abel has been exchanged for U-2 pilot Gary Powers. Powers was sentenced by Russia to 10 years in 1960, and only weeks ago wrote his family that he had little hope of an early release. But negotiations between the two governments bore fruit. Since his release, Powers was not immediately available for photographs.
Seen that kind of newsreel?
Yes, it is, and it's very fascinating. Greg and I were discussing the nickel, and unfortunately, that's not the way the nickel was found, nor was that the boy who found it, but it was fascinating to relive that as I live. As Jennifer said, some lawyers don't get rid of anything. Well, I still have a collection of so much of this case that has brought me back a lot of memories.
So when, let's go from in the beginning. You're from Rochester originally, right? You're
Yes,
native Rochester?
Born and raised in Rochester. Went away for about 13 years when I went to college, the Army for 3 years, law school, Justice Department for a total of 5, the last of which was back in charge of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Rochester in 1960.
During the time period, 1957, well, let's go back, because you know the story. We just saw the hollow nickel case, which they gave a depiction. 1953, 54 time period.
You know, the nickel was found, I believe, in 1954, and we didn't get the answer. The United States government was unable to decipher the message, which was a numeric encrypted message using all of our finest talents until the Soviet defector turned into the American embassy in Paris in May of 1957.
So you kind of, this is almost going forward to go backwards. You, in your curiosity, were curious about who the kid was that actually had that, and then you, doing some real gumshoe work, found him.
Well, actually, yeah, the FBI actually found him. His name was James Bosarts, and it was fascinating. As I was telling Greg, in the 50th anniversary of this case, and I have had an interest in this case ever since I was involved in it, because I wondered what was actually accomplished in the conspiracy that we proved. We didn't prove a substantive offense. We proved a conspiracy to steal secrets and to transmit them to a foreign government. And so I've read a lot of things and followed a lot of things, but on the 50th anniversary, I said, whatever happened to the young newsboy, James Bosarts, because I had handled James Bosarts, had located him, and was involved in presenting him as a witness at the trial. and essentially that's all he had to do is see the nickel and say, yes, I found a nickel, and gave it to a detective of the New York Police Department. But I was curious whatever happened to that young boy. Well, what I had forgotten was that from the time that he had found the nickel, and he had then was at RPI, he was about 18 or 19 at the time of the trial. I was 27, so we were almost contemporaries. But I happened to have lunch with him. I called him up. I went on the internet, got a telephone number for James Bosarts, found one in Florida, found one in New York City, and got an answer back from both messages, and ultimately set up a luncheon. Spent 2 or 3 hours with him where we went through the details of how he had found the nickel and what he had done with it. And it's a fascinating story that time doesn't permit me to repeat sort of what I summarized with Greg, but it's an incredibly humorous story about how he found the nickel and then turned it over. And ultimately, it led to, we had immediate confirmation that the spy who turned himself in, Rhino Heihanen, was absolutely genuine. We had so much corroboration with the excellent work of the FBI and the CIA. And at the time, by the way, the CIA operated overseas, FBI operated in the United States, and the two never talked to each other. But in this case, they did. And ultimately, the information that was obtained was immediately verified. But we only knew that there was his boss, Heihanen's boss, by the name of Mark, who had frequented a number of places in New York, including a building, the Ovington building, which was located across from the federal court where ultimately he was indicted and tried. And by the way, the picture of the court was nicely shown in that film, but this is a picture that I took in November of 1957, and that portion of the court that was shown there was actually the courtroom itself and where the jury, the petty jury, met and deliberated the fate of Abel. And just by way of a humorous note, I guess it's humorous, but it's American. We didn't have air conditioning in that courthouse at the time, and the windows were open, and it was an October day, a warm October day, and they were dedicating a new New York State Supreme Court building immediately adjacent to the side of the building that you've seen in that picture and that is shown here. And of course, in a dedication of a Supreme Court building, the band plays the Star-Spangled Banner. And, while the jury was deliberating the fate of Rudolf Abel. You can't make that up. Jim Donovan's book, it's a fascinating book, and I recommend it to all of you, as a matter of fact. And I don't want to correct Greg, but...
Well, welcome to my world. My wife's here.
I wish that Spielberg and company would acknowledge that indeed they did copy from this book, because my son Mark happens to own the film rights to this book, but Spielberg says it was an original screenplay. And the truth of the matter is, all of the references to the trial in this case are not believable, they're not real, and it didn't happen the way you saw it in the movie. But aside from that, there's another book, which is an excellent book. Louise Bernikoff, who is an artist, actually she's not an artist, but in the community of the artist, and she and another artist in the building actually were friends with Abel, and they wrote a book, and it's an excellent book. It's probably much more understandable than a legal treatise. It describes the man, and the man that really blended in so well as just a retired person who was an artist who loved to strum the guitar, played chess in Washington Square, and all of those things that an ordinary retired person would do.
So you're current, at the time the case broke, you're in Washington.
Right.
And you're in the U.S. Attorney's office there?
No, I'm in the Internal Security Division of the Department of Justice. Fresh out of law school, I started in November of 1956, graduated from Georgetown Law School in September of 1956, admitted to the district court in D.C. on 1st of October, took the New York State Bar, so I didn't start my job with the Justice Department until November. And, 6, 7, 8 months later, I'm asked to go to New York City for a couple of days, and I went up there with a suit, 2 shirts, and a toothbrush, expecting to go back. And 6 months later, after the Abel case, I got back to Washington.
What did they see about you that recruited you to be part of Tompkins' team? That was the U.S. attorney, right, Tompkins?
William F. Tompkins was not the U.S. attorney. He was the assistant attorney general in charge of the Internal Security Division. And I don't know the answer to that. We were not a large group. We had some super people, though, in terms of the young men whom I served with. I was probably the most dispensable. My only litigation experience prior to this time was that the United States Attorney in North Carolina had refused to present matters to the grand jury involving the sale of tobacco to Red China, which was alleged to be in violation of the Trading with the Enemy Act, and we don't like to support our enemies, so there are prohibitions against that. But he said no North Carolinian would ever indict another North Carolinian for the sale of tobacco to anybody. And so they figured, if somebody's going to go down the tubes, we'll designate Tony Palermo as a special attorney. And I got specially deputized to represent the Justice Department. U.S. attorney down there cooperated with me. The federal judge cooperated with me. I got indictments, and they pled guilty. And so, and they did the same thing in Virginia. And I guess probably they said, well, we can send this kid up to New York for whatever is happening there. Well, what happened there was this case. And I left a car on the street. It was just off of Connecticut Avenue. And 6 months later, when I got back to Washington, the car was still there with all 4 wheels. It did not turn over.
So you were assigned to this case. What did you know going in about Abel? What intelligence did you already had?
The only thing that the FBI and we had was what Hayhanen had told the people at the American Embassy in Paris, that there is an espionage operation in New York, and he told them about various activities and how they operated.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, how they operated, and essentially that got corroborated in a very quick fashion. For instance, you saw the film with hollowed out bolts and so forth. Well, one of the places was in Prospect Park, where he designated these areas which were drop areas and message areas and so forth. And he said that there was a particular step at a particular entrance to Prospect Park in Brooklyn, and it's a big park. It's like Central Park. It's huge. So the FBI goes over, and there's not a hole where this fellow said he used to find his messages in hollowed out containers. But they discovered that there had been a hole there, and the maintenance people of the city of New York had filled it up. They broke open the concrete, and in it they found a bolt, which when opened up had another microfiche message in it on a typewriter, which we were able to show was a typewriter that Abel had loaned to Bert Silverman, one of the artists in the Overton building. And it was that type of thing. But then going back to the nickel, Hayhanen said another thing we did was put messages inside of nickels. And at his home up in near Bear Mountain, along the Hudson River, they had some hollowed out coins. And the particular hollowed out coin that Jimmy Bolsarts had found wasn't opened with a razor like you saw in the movie last night. Basically, it was a pinprick on one of the dots, one of the periods on the initials. And you press that, and it was a spring mechanism, and it opened it up. Well, somehow, when Jimmy was bouncing them around, he dropped them out, coming down a landing, and the landing happened to be no light landing. And Jimmy, as I mentioned to Greg, knew that he got 50 cents from these 2 teachers, and he could only find 45 cents. So he kept looking, and he found the halves of 2 nickels, and he found the microfiche in it. Well, basically, they found the same thing at Hayhanen's home. So it was stuff like that that we knew very quickly that we had a real espionage operation, but we didn't have the man. And so I say we, I'm talking the United States government, because I was not involved in the case at that point. What happened is you heard the description about FBI's monitoring and following people and so forth. Well, Hayhanen had said that he had been in the neighborhood of this building, the Ovington building, on occasion. And indeed, I believe he was even in the building at one time. So they kept it under surveillance. Hayhanen turned himself in around May 1st, and along about May 18th, with 24-hour surveillance, the light goes on in the studio that was rented by a man known by the name of Emil Goldfuss. Basically, it was on for about an hour, and then the light went out, and the FBI happened to be able to follow the man wearing a straw hat with a white band. And this is a picture that appeared in the Life magazine article the week after the indictment. This is a full-page picture that was in the same magazine article, and that's a young Tony Palermo, that's William F. Tompkins, and that's my colleague Jim Featherstone, who was out a year ahead of me. So we were high-staffed. I think my salary at the time was $4,400 a year, which, I think cost of living increases that somewhat. But Tommy Tompkins had a lot of faith, or they didn't have anybody else to put on the job, and so we were up there. Jim Featherstone and I, after they found Abel, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, were assigned to talk to Hayhanen to see if we could get him to agree to testify, because he refused to testify. He had family back in Russia, and that's one of the reasons why there was a delay. And while Mr. Abel, and his name incidentally wasn't Abel, it's a name that he gave to the Immigration and Naturalization down in McAllen, Texas. It happened to be the name of a lifelong friend of his who was also in the KGB, and it was by pre-design that if he were to be captured, he would give the name of his colleague. So as a sign to the Soviets that he was captured, but he was not cooperating. And unlike the movie, which basically said, he was held incommunicado, when he was taken down to McAllen, Texas, he had a lawyer, and the lawyer said, this is what happens if you're an illegal alien. You're not charged with any crimes. They deport you. They'll send you back. Oh, he said, okay, my name is Rudolf Ivanovich Abel, and I'm a Soviet citizen, and I'd like to be sent back. Well, Jim Featherstone and I were working with Hayhanen, who incidentally is also pictured here. And this is a sketch of Hayhanen that was made by Rudolf Abel, whose name really was Willie Fisher, and he was indeed, as they pointed out in the movie, but they didn't know it, and the world didn't know it until about 20 years later, was born in England, and was an Englishman of Russian emigre parents who were friends of Lenin. And while his father was in England from about 1898 until the Bolsheviks took over in Russia, they were running guns and everything else to support the Bolsheviks. And so the man known as Abel, whose real name was Fisher, was a dedicated supporter of the communists.
Abel came to the United States in 1948, and to support him, Moscow sent Hayhanen as sort of his assistant.
That's correct.
And at some point, Abel made the determination to send Hayhanen back. Basically, your job is done.
Yeah. Hayhanen had several problems. His English was not good. His credentials, the Russians sent him to Finland, where he actually lived for many years under, again, and was given a false identity of an American who, in fact, had died in Finland. And then he came over legally under an illegal name, a false name, on board ship with a wife. And he was given various assignments, and that's what the indictment, which is, I've got a copy of it here, that we prepared outlines all of these overt acts in furtherance of the conspiracy, and talk about what they did. And that's where you get into the Rosenbergs and Helen Sobel, which came up during the trial. And there was money, $10,000 was supposed to be given to Helen Sobel, whose husband was sentenced to 30 years in connection with the Rosenberg crimes, and both Rosenbergs, of course, were executed, and was denied violently. And there's newspaper articles about protesting this. The truth is that many years later, Morton Sobel admitted it. There were studies of several different agencies that have proved that the Rosenbergs did commit the acts, although there's still some question about Mrs. Rosenberg. And also there's some question about whether or not indeed Abel picked up the pieces as the leader of this covert operation that was formerly headed up by a predecessor of his in the United States with the Rosenbergs.
But that information was very critical to at least connect Abel to Mrs. Sobel, which of course married to Martin Sobel,
Yep.
which is all the Rosenberg world.
Yeah. And essentially, there was one of the chaps here, I think you're going to get it later when talk about the hockey fellow. One of the other assignments that became a critical piece of evidence was Sergeant Roy Rhodes, who had been in charge of the motor pool at the American Embassy in Moscow. And basically, before his family got there, they were able to seduce him with women and liquor, and he started providing them with information and promised to continue to do so. And that was important because he had a brother who worked in an atomic plant. And so we were able to establish that one of the assignments of Hayhanen with Abel was to locate Roy Rhodes. And so that was part of our testimony too, and essentially it was an extremely important part of establishing the primary case that we had, that they were looking for atomic energy and trying to pass it along to the Soviets.
The case itself sort of surrounded, well, they admitted, they from the substantive law aspect, seemingly they said, yes, we are. And they played their card on the procedural aspect of it, trying to distinguish themselves from Rosenberg, who were U.S. citizens dealing with trade secrets. And here's a Russian, they're hence an alien, and trying to distinguish the two procedurally. Is that a correct assessment?
Well, I've thought about that, and I have the greatest respect for Jim Donovan and for his team. And he was assisted not by, as the movie showed, some yearling who was anxious and excited about this. He had two former assistant U.S. attorneys, one of whom was Tom Debevoise, who went on to become the Attorney General of Vermont and dean of their law school, and Arnie Freeman, who went on to become a New York State Supreme Court judge. And both of them were experienced assistant U.S. attorneys in the Southern District of New York, each of them with more than 4 years' experience. So their team was a hell of a lot more experience than the government's team. Not as dedicated, perhaps, but it was interesting because in reading Jim's book, and it's an excellent book, he kept a diary. And I've thought, gee, what if I had ever kept a diary? I didn't have time because these things were coming at us fast and furious. But he talks about the issue that you've just raised, the legal issue, suppression, and that was their best shot. And he said, well, the government's known about this man Abel for 2 years, and they've got all these big lawyers and legal briefs and so forth. It's going to be tough. Well, I was it. I was the guy that interviewed the FBI agents, the immigration and naturalizations, the guy who prepared the briefs. I've got my 38-page brief that's written on carbon copy here, the affidavit that was submitted for my boss to sign. The only changes he made in it was upon information and belief. He added those words because he hadn't interviewed these people, I did. And so basically I'm thinking, I'm reading Jim's book saying, this big government law firm is doing all this work, and here's this kid that's been out of law school 1 year.
Yeah. principally their defense, and I'm quoting from Jim's book, was unique. The first time in American history a man is being threatened with death as a sentence on the charge that he acted as a spy for a foreign nation we are legally at peace with. We weren't at war with Soviet Union, it was a Cold War.
That's right. That's right.
And how did the judge distinguish that? And how did you guys distinguish that?
You know, again, I go back to, he did make those points, and I, even to this day, wonder about, he couldn't defend on the facts.
Yeah.
Basically, they were incontrovertible, and we had corroborative proof so intense that there was no way for him to go. So the legal argument of the search and seizure was a good one. But I'm not sure that you want to, in effect, admit that this man is not like a traitor. He's doing his job. And so I don't think it, the jury was out about 4 hours. I think they went out about 1 o'clock, went to lunch, came back about 2 o'clock, and I think the verdict came in about 5 o'clock that day. So obviously it wasn't effective in terms of persuading that, okay, this is all right, because, I mean, I just don't see the effectiveness of that argument. And I have the greatest respect and admiration for Jim, and I should point out that I am absolutely angry at the movie projecting Jim Donovan backdooring the judge. That did not happen. It happened in court. It happened in chambers with all of the attorneys present. He explained that he wanted to ask the judge for leniency. He did raise the issue of potentially exchanging Abel for someone of value in the future. He was absolutely right. And the government did not ask for the death penalty, but we asked for a very severe sentence because we took the matter seriously. And this was the Cold War era where we were worried about. They got their shot up into space before we did. Mm-hmm. So these were intense times. Other things about the bombing of their home were not correct. They didn't live in a home. They lived in a high rise. And as you saw the day they were exchanged in the movie, and he got back, and the trees are got leaves on them. There seem to be flowers, and I'm saying, you know, Brooklyn's a great place. A tree does grow in Brooklyn, but the leaves don't grow in February.
What pressures were Assistant Attorney General Tompkins and the staff because of the Cold War? Here we are, 1957. Things are we're kind of concluding the McCarthy era, but no, it's dark, and you got Khrushchev, you've got pounding the table, you got we will bury you. Yeah. What was the pressure on your office or your team?
Well, we knew it was serious. It was certainly big time. I had been in the Army counterintelligence, and I was trained at Fort Holabird, and then sent over to Europe, and had more intelligence and German language study at Oberammergau. I had worked in a covert world in Munich, had probably 500 different espionage operations going on. Everybody was spying on everybody, and that's what's still going on in the world today. So we took it all seriously, and when I'm there and I'm saying, my God, this is happening in my backyard in New York City. So we took it very seriously, and the pressure was to do it right.
Did you get any sense that the president, Eisenhower, was kind of tracking this, or that sort of executive interest?
Well, you know, at my pay level, I didn't get up into any policy or have any idea what discussions were had. Interestingly enough, the day after the verdict came in, Herbert Brownell, who was the Attorney General, resigned. So I think that there was a good deal of attention, and at the highest level, including my boss, Tommy Tompkins, I'm sure they had a lot of conversations. We were very unhappy with Commissioner Swing of the Immigration and Naturalization, who basically was quoted during the hearings that we had, and we had the FBI agents and and the immigration and naturalization agents in a 3-day hearing before the judge on the suppression hearing. And the New York Times comes out with a statement by Swing saying, we've known about Abel for 2 years. Well, we did not know about Abel for 2 years. So I'm not sure that the highest level people who were talking knew anything at all about what was going on. But I'm sure that the President of the United States was aware.
The judge comes down with a sentence of 30 years, ostensibly listening to Jim Donovan's defense that maybe at some point somewhere for humanitarian needs or for governmental needs that may be an option.
Yeah.
Were you surprised by that?
No. Judge Mortimer Byers was an absolutely magnificent jurist who was very, very hard. My very first trial witness was before Judge Byers, and it was early in the case, and I had to show that the person named Emil Goldfuss had purchased spectrographic film, and it was a simple business entry and so forth. And the judge said, what's that got to do with this defendant? Because we hadn't shown any proof that Rudolf Abel was Emil Goldfuss. And Kevin Maroney, who was the best lawyer on the team, who basically wasn't a trial lawyer but was an appellate lawyer, is pulling my jacket saying, subject to connection, subject to connection. So I'm sort of saying to the judge, subject, we have other witnesses, Your Honor. And the judge allowed it. But he was that way with everybody. But this judge was an absolutely magnificent judge, wrote an opinion, and essentially affirmed the fact that entities within the Justice Department, because immigration and naturalization then, the FBI, the internal security, we were all part of the Justice Department. And the judge could not perceive any problem with entities of one government working together for a common end. Whereas Donovan saying, you had a choice of either charging him with immigration violation, illegal entry, or criminal charge of espionage. You couldn't do both. The judge couldn't find any reason why that was true. The Second Circuit unanimously affirmed that decision. The Supreme Court of the United States looked at it twice. They argued twice, and it was a close decision, 5-4. There was no precedent on whether or not an illegal alien had the same rights of a constitution of a citizen of the United States. And that was new law. And fortunately for the case, 5-4 decision, the search of the, actually the whole story about the searches is you have to divide it into two places, the hotel where he was arrested and his studio. But a treasure trove of stuff was thrown into the wastebasket, as well as some of it destroyed, as shown in the movie, by Abel that they didn't detect. But the stuff that was found inside the wastebasket in hollowed out nickels, all sorts of incriminating stuff, and a lot of letters from home, which were very interesting. It was a fascinating case, no question at all.
Well, and obviously part of your briefing that you prepared, that procedural question found its way to the Supreme Court, and ultimately Justice Frankfurter agreed with you.
He did 5-4.
Yeah.
And Jeffrey Kahn, who is a distinguished professor of constitutional law at SMU, has become a friend of mine. He was asked by the State Department and by the Russian lawyers and the Justice Department to present a paper about the Abel case, the legal issues in the Abel case, to the Russians over in St. Petersburg. And he got in touch with me and chatted with him, and I gave him some of the facts that I think clarified his factual understanding, which helped to make it a more accurate paper than it might have been otherwise, because at a program that was put on before the Brooklyn Historical Society last November, there was Jeffrey Kahn, myself, John Donovan, the son of Jim Donovan, and a wonderful professor from England, Vin Arty, who basically got his PhD in the life of Rudolf Abel and has interviewed his daughter alive in Moscow. We're on the panel, but Jeffrey still believes that the Supreme Court they got it wrong and it should have been not permitted to follow this, and evidence acknowledged that all the courts that have considered it have agreed with Tony.
Before I bring up Jerry here to kind of segue, and then we're going to have both of you do a little maybe together. 1960, Gary Francis Power, YouTube pilot, as in the movie shows, goes down. Ultimately, it leads to the swap. Did you follow that with intense interest?
Well, I did. As a matter of fact, by then, I had, immediately after the trial, I was fortunate to have been asked to become an assistant United States attorney in the Southern District of Manhattan, which is the greatest law firm in the world, in my opinion, and wonderful experiences working there. And then ultimately I was asked to take over the U.S. Attorney's Office, which was then a one-person office in Rochester. And so 1962, February 10th, or probably around 5 o'clock in the morning, at that time I think we had one child expecting a second, and the telephone rings, and it's the media. They want to know what did I think about the exchange of Francis Gary Powers for Rudolf Abel. And I said, well, I don't know anything at all about Francis Gary Powers. He's the pilot over Russia. I don't know what that means, but I do believe that the Russians got back a very, very important spy because of the background that I had in the case. So there's an article, I guess it's probably not on this side, but on this side, and it has my comments. And my comment was, I think the Russians got a pretty good deal.